In a Georgia diner, 72-year-old Harold Green, a Vietnam War hero, faces mockery for his worn shoes and faded military jacket. Ignored or pitied by patrons, he remains silent, haunted by memories of saving lives under fire. As the diner owner considers asking him to leave, a young Marine, Matthew, intervenes, revealing Harold's heroic past. The diner transforms from judgment to reverence as Marines honor him, and shame shifts to respect. A child's innocent question sparks truth. But what secrets does Harold still carry? Why does he cling to those tattered shoes? Uncover the mystery. Watch now. Join us to honor unsung heroes like Harold. Subscribe to channel on YouTube for inspiring stories that reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary. Your support keeps their legacies alive. Click subscribe, share, and comment. Let's celebrate courage together. Visit our channel now and be part of the journey. The Georgia sun blazed outside, its heat pressing against the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Harold Grayson, 72, pushed through the creaking door, his steps slow but resolute. His faded military jacket hung loosely, the once vibrant green now dulled by time. Silver hair, mussed by the restless wind, framed a face etched with decades of unspoken stories. His shoes, frayed and barely held together by tattered laces, scuffed softly as he moved. In a corner booth, four young men erupted in laughter. "Check out this guy," one sneered, pointing. "Did he just escape a junkyard?" Another chimed in, "Those shoes look like they've marched through hell and back." Their voices sliced through the diner, drawing fleeting glances from other patrons. Some shook their heads, others looked away, unwilling to engage. Harold's face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on his usual table by the window. He pulled out a chair, its legs scraping faintly, and sat with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the room's judgment. Inside, a quiet weariness stirred. He felt their stares, their mockery, but buried it deep, where it joined the weight of a lifetime's battles. Clara, the diner's owner, approached, her eyes flickering with unease. "Coffee, Mr. Grayson?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with guilt. He nodded, and she returned with a steaming cup, free as always, a small act of kindness amid the tension. Harold's weathered hands, once capable of carrying men through gunfire, trembled as they grasped the cup. His eyes, deep with sorrow, gazed out the window, seeking solace in the familiar view. A young boy nearby whispered, "Mom, why's he look like that?" His mother, lips tight, sipped her drink and muttered, "Just eat, honey," dodging the question. On Harold's wrist, a scratched military watch ticked steadily, its face worn but relentless, a relic of survival. The diner's whispers grew sharper. A server muttered to a coworker, "He's bad for business." His colleague nodded, "The boss might finally do something." One of the young men, Jake, stood, egged on by his friends. "Do it," they urged. He swaggered toward Harold's table, bumping it accidentally. Coffee spilled, and Jake smirked. "Sorry, old man. Reflexes not what they used to be." His friends laughed. Harold silently reached for a napkin, dabbing at the spill, his heart aching, not with anger but with the sting of indifference around him. He'd faced worse, but the silence of others hurt more than words. The server leaned toward Clara. "We should ask him to leave. Those shoes, it's unsanitary." Clara hesitated, guilt warring her conscience, warring with business. A businessman entered, sawing the spilled coffee and Jake's grin, and met Harold's eyes briefly. Harold hoped for intervention, but the man turned away, hiding behind his newspaper. Clara nodded to the server. "Do it quietly." The server placed a blank check before Harold. "Zorler, we can't serve you today." The message was clear. Leave. Silence fell. Patrons hid behind their menus or phones, avoiding Harold's gaze. Jake's friends snickered, one pointing to the door. Harold rose, his spine straight, dignity intact. He adjusted his cap, a quiet crown. Clara mumbled, "Maybe next time, different shoes," her voice breaking. Harold stepped toward the door, his shoes scuffing, when a Marine entered. Removing his cap, he strode to Harold, stood at attention, and bowed his head in deep respect, silencing the room's assumptions, teetering. The door of the small diner swung open with a deliberate creak, and a young Marine stepped inside, his presence commanding the room in an instant. His uniform was pristine, every crease sharp, every button gleaming under the dim fluorescent lights. He was about 30, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had stared into the abyss of war and come back changed. They were hard, unyielding, yet there was a flicker of something softer beneath the surface, something like purpose. He scanned the diner with a single fluid glance, taking in every detail. The worn counter, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation. Then his gaze settled on Harold, an older man seated alone at a small table near the door, his hands folded quietly in his lap. The air in the diner shifted, growing heavy with unease. In the corner booth, a group of young men, loud and brash just moments before, fell silent, their smirks fading as they watched the Marine. The diner's owner, a woman with tired eyes and a stained apron, froze mid-step, a coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen seemed to pause, as if the entire room held its breath. "Is there a problem here?" The Marine's voice sliced through the silence, clear and steady, but laced with an edge that made the hairs on the back of people's necks stand up. For a fleeting moment, hope flickered in the hearts of a few onlookers. Harold, with his worn shoes and threadbare jacket, had been the target of whispered scorn from the young men in the booth. Their taunts had been subtle but cruel, their laughter sharp enough to cut. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to stand up for him. The thought hung in the air, fragile and desperate, until it shattered with a devastating twist. The Marine moved forward, his polished boots clicking against the linoleum floor, and stopped directly in front of Harold, blocking his path to the door. The old man's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew what was coming. Or so he thought. The young men in the booth exchanged glances, their smirks returning, bolder now. One leaned in and whispered, his voice low but audible in the tense quiet. "Even the military thinks he doesn't belong here." The words landed like a punch, and Harold's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his napkin, though his face remained impassive. He was used to this, used to the judgment, the assumptions, the way people looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt, didn't carve another small wound into a heart already scarred by years of quiet endurance. Near the counter, a 7-year-old boy named Tommy tugged at his mother's sleeve, his wide eyes darting between the Marine and Harold. "Mom, why is the soldier stopping him?" His voice was small but piercing, cutting through the heavy silence. His mother, a woman with worry lines etched deep into her face, shushed him quickly, her voice tight with anxiety. "Tommy, be quiet." She pulled him closer, as if shielding him from something she couldn't quite name. The Marine stood tall before Harold, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The diner seemed to hold his collective breath, waiting for the inevitable. For a terrible, agonizing moment, it felt certain that the Marine was about to escort Harold out, to confirm the cruel assumptions hanging in the air. The old man's eyes remained fixed on the table, his weathered hands still, but inside a storm churned. He didn't want this, didn't want the attention, the confrontation, the pity. He just wanted to eat his meal and leave, to slip back into the shadows where he'd lived for so long. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the Marine did something no one expected. With a single graceful motion, he removed his cap, tucking it under his arm. He stood at perfect attention, his posture rigid, his presence a silent command for respect. The diner went utterly still. The clink of a spoon hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot, but no one moved to retrieve it. No one dared breathe. Only Tommy, with the unfiltered curiosity of a child, noticed the glint of moisture in the Marine's eyes as he approached Harold. The boy's small hand tightened around his mother's, but he didn't speak again. He didn't need to. "Sir," the Marine said, his voice ringing out like a bell, clear and resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone present. The young men in the booth froze, their smug expressions crumbling into confusion. One whispered, "What's happening?" But no one answered. They were all too stunned, too caught in the gravity of the moment. The Marine bowed his head slightly, a gesture of reverence that sent a ripple of shock through the room. "I'd like to honor the man who saved my father's life, Sergeant Harold Green." The words landed like a thunderclap. The diner's owner gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. A middle-aged man at a nearby table stood instinctively, his movements slow and reverent, and quietly removed his baseball cap. The air felt charged, as if the very walls of the diner were leaning in to listen. The Marine, his name was Matthew, though no one knew it yet, placed a carefully wrapped file on Harold's table. The Department of Defense seal gleamed on its cover, the word official stamped in bold letters. Inside, hidden from view but heavy with meaning, were classified mission documents. A faded photograph slipped free, showing a younger Harold, his face grim but determined, carrying a wounded soldier across his shoulders. Blood stained his uniform, his jaw was set, and his eyes burned with a fire that spoke of duty beyond self. "He didn't just save my father," Matthew continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "He rescued 4 others, men who would have died without him. He did it on legs already torn by shrapnel, refusing to stop until every one of them was safe." One of the young men in the booth took an involuntary step back, his face paling as the weight of his earlier words crashed down on him. We didn't know," he stammered, but his voice was barely a whisper, lost in the enormity of the moment. Harold didn't speak. His eyes lifted, meeting Matthew's, and in that silent exchange, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. "Son, this isn't necessary," his gaze seemed to say. "Let it go." But Matthew's jaw tightened, and his voice grew firmer, laced with a quiet fierceness. "Sergeant, honor needs to be returned to its rightful place." The diner door swung open again, and the room seemed to tilt with the weight of what followed. 2 more Marines entered, their uniforms as crisp as Matthew's, their faces solemn, then another and a fourth. They moved with precision, forming a perfect line behind Harold's table. Each removed their cap in unison, tucking it under their arm, and stood at attention. The sight was breathtaking, a silent tribute that spoke louder than any words could. Tommy's voice broke the stillness, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mom, is he a hero?" His mother, tears streaming down her face, nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, Tommy, a real one." A middle-aged customer at the counter murmured, almost to himself, "I've heard that name before. My dad used to talk about a Harold Green from the war." His voice was soft, but it carried, adding another layer to the unfolding truth. The diner's owner, still clutching the coffee pot, moved toward Harold's table. She picked up the bill she'd placed there just minutes earlier, her hands shaking as she tore it into pieces. "Mr. Harold," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry." Harold acknowledged her with a slight nod, his expression gentle but guarded. There was no anger in his eyes, no recrimination, just a quiet acceptance that made her apology feel both necessary and inadequate. A young server, the one who had hesitated earlier when asked to remove Harold from the diner, approached him now, her face flushed with shame. She knelt beside his table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." One of the Marines standing behind Harold placed a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. "Those shoes aren't old," he said, his voice low but firm, gesturing to the worn boots Harold wore. "They're a legacy." Then turning to the silent diner, he spoke louder, his words meant for everyone. Sergeant Green refused evacuation until every wounded man was safe. When mortar fire tore through his legs, he still crawled through the jungle, carrying the last survivor, my father, for over a mile. Harold's eyes remained downcast, his discomfort with the attention palpable. He had never sought this, not the praise, not the recognition, not the medals he'd quietly refused after Vietnam. He had done what needed doing, and when the war was over, he had slipped away, letting the world forget him because that was how he wanted it. But now the past had found him, and it refused to stay buried. Matthew's voice softened, but it still carried the weight of truth. After Vietnam, he never claimed his medals, never sought recognition. The military lost track of him because that's how he wanted it. The young man who had mocked Harold earlier now stood with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his shame. Another, the one who had accidentally spilled coffee on Harold's table, stepped forward, his voice barely audible. "Sir, I can't expect forgiveness, but I need to apologize." His hands trembled, and he couldn't meet Harold's eyes. Harold finally spoke, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "Son, judgment comes easy when you don't know the weight another carries. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a lifetime's wisdom, quieting the room once more. In that moment, the diner wasn't just a place of coffee and cheap meals. It was a crucible where past and present collided, where shame and honor stood face to face, and where a man who had carried the weight of war in silence was finally seen for who he truly was. In the quiet hum of the small-town diner, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation paused as a wave of raw, heartfelt applause erupted. It wasn't the kind of clapping that felt rehearsed or hollow. It was a collective outpouring, born from a mix of shame for past judgments and awe at the unassuming man who'd just been revealed as a hero. Harold Green, with his worn-out shoes and weathered jacket, sat at his usual window table, his coffee cooling in its chipped mug. His face, etched with lines from decades of silent burdens, betrayed no expectation of the moment. Yet, as the applause swelled, his eyes, steady, guarded, flickered with something unspoken, a weight he'd carried longer than anyone in the room could fathom. Among the diners, a businessman who'd once turned his back on Harold, dismissing him as just another drifter, now stood, his polished shoes squeaking against the linoleum. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet, not out of obligation but from a sudden, piercing need to make amends. "I'd like to cover everyone's meal today," he announced, his voice thick with emotion, "in honor of Sergeant Green." The words hung in the air, heavy with respect, as if he were trying to repay a debt he hadn't known he owed. His gesture wasn't just about money, it was an acknowledgement of the invisible scars Harold bore, the kind no one in that diner had bothered to notice until now. Across the room, a young boy named Tommy slipped from his mother's gentle hold, his small sneakers scuffing the floor as he approached Harold with a purpose far beyond his years. His wide eyes held a mix of reverence and curiosity, the kind only a child can muster when they sense something profound. Extending his hand, he spoke softly but clearly. "My grandpa was a soldier too. He told me real heroes don't brag about what they've done." Harold's calloused hand enveloped Tommy's, and for a moment, the old soldier's stoic mask softened. A faint smile tugged at his lips, revealing a tenderness he rarely allowed to surface. "Your grandpa was a wise man," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of memories he'd long buried. In that handshake, a quiet understanding passed between them, a boy too young to know war and a man who'd seen too much of it, connected by the shared legacy of sacrifice. Matthew, the Marine who'd sparked this moment, stood tall, his posture rigid with the discipline of his training. His eyes, though, were soft, brimming with gratitude as he addressed Harold again. "Sergeant Green, your unit's holding a reunion next week. They've been looking for you for years, decades even. Will you come?" The question wasn't just an invitation, it was a plea, a chance to pull Harold back into a brotherhood he'd left behind. For the first time that morning, Harold's composure faltered. His fingers tightened around his coffee mug, and his gaze drifted to the window, where the world outside blurred into the ghosts of his past. "Yes, sir," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some debts can't ever be repaid, but they deserve to be remembered." The words carried the ache of a man who'd spent a lifetime wrestling with the cost of survival, wondering if he'd done enough for those who hadn't made it home. The year was 1974, and the jungles of Quezon burned with the chaos of war. Harold Green, a combat medic sergeant, moved through the haze of artillery fire, his heart pounding, not with fear for himself, but with a relentless drive to save others. Shrapnel had ripped through his legs, each step a searing agony, yet he dragged 5 soldiers, one by one, to safety. Among them was Matthew's father, a young rookie then, wide-eyed and trembling, his life hanging by the thread of Harold's courage. Blood soaked Harold's uniform, staining the earth beneath him, but he pressed on, carrying the last man to cover even as his own body screamed in protest. When he finally collapsed, his mission complete, there were no cameras, no cheering crowds. Back home, no parades awaited him, no medals adorned his chest. The world moved on, indifferent to his sacrifice. Harold chose silence, not out of pride, but because he saw his actions as duty, not heroism. To him, the real heroes were the ones who never left that jungle. Each week, Harold returned to the same diner, claiming his spot by the window. The view outside offered no answers, but the ritual, coffee, quiet memories, kept him grounded. He'd sit there staring into the steam rising from his mug, seeing faces of comrades who'd never grow old. Matthew, raised on his father's stories, grew up with a reverence for men like Harold. If you ever meet an old soldier with worn-out shoes, his father would say, his voice heavy with gratitude, don't judge him. You don't know the paths those shoes have traveled. That's why Matthew stood at attention that day, his salute a bridge across decades, connecting a son's gratitude to a man who'd saved his father's life. The next morning, Harold stepped into the diner and froze. The walls, once plain, now held a photograph of him, hung proudly beside the American flag. Beneath it, an inscription read, "We owe you our gratitude." Belated but sincere. The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap, stirring emotions he'd long kept locked away. The mockers who'd once sneered at his tattered appearance were gone, replaced by new faces. Veterans mostly, who'd heard whispers of his story. They didn't crowd him or demand his tales. They simply sat nearby, offering nods of silent kinship. The young server who'd once tried to shoo Harold away now made it her mission to keep his coffee hot, her hands steady as she wiped his table clean. Her small acts of care were her own apology, a way to honor the man she'd misjudged. A week later, a package arrived for Harold, its contents a pair of pristine combat boots, a gift from Matthew's unit. A note tucked inside had read simply, "To replace what was worn in service." Harold ran his fingers over the leather, grateful but resolute. "These old shoes," he said, holding up his weathered pair, "they carried me home when I thought I wouldn't make it. I'll wear them until they fall apart, or I do." The boots, scuffed and frayed, were more than footwear. They were a testament to survival, to promises kept under fire. Tommy became a regular visitor, his small figure a bright spot in Harold's routine. He'd bring treasures, a feather, a smooth river rock, a crayon drawing of soldiers standing tall. "Mr. Harold, will you be here tomorrow?" he'd ask, his voice hopeful, his eyes bright with admiration. Harold's smile, rare and warm, was always his answer. "As long as these shoes can walk, Tommy, I'll be right here." For the first time in years, when Harold left the diner, he felt the weight of eyes on him. Not pitying, but respectful. The owner stopped charging him for his coffee, though Harold insisted on paying. They struck a deal. His money went into a jar for veterans who couldn't afford a meal. The jar overflowed weekly, a quiet testament to the community's awakening. Harold's spirited from his chair by the window, once a refuge for his solitude, became a place of reverence. Young people, curious but respectful, would ask him questions, not about battles or glory, but about the friends he'd lost. The real heroes, he'd say, his voice soft but steady, never got to come home. His worn boots, once a source of scorn, became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the most ordinary things, a pair of shoes, a cup of coffee, a quiet seat, could hold extraordinary stories. Harold didn't need medals or fanfare. All he'd ever wanted was peace, a chance to carry his memories without judgment. And in that diner, surrounded by newfound respect, he finally found it. The quiet hum of the diner filled the air, a familiar symphony of clinking plates, murmured conversations, and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. Sunlight streamed through the large window, casting a warm golden glow across the worn wooden floor, illuminating the chair where Harold always sat. It was an unremarkable chair, scuffed and slightly wobbly, but it held a kind of unspoken reverence, as though it knew the weight of the man who claimed it every morning. The world outside bustled along, oblivious to the small miracle unfolding within those four walls, where a simple act of humanity was about to shift the hearts of everyone present. Harold sat in his usual spot, his gnarled hands resting on the table, fingers tracing the familiar grooves in the wood. His shoes, scuffed and thinning at the soles, told a story of miles walked, burdens carried, and years endured. He wasn't a man who sought attention. His presence was as steady and unassuming as the sunrise. But today his eyes held a quiet storm, a flicker of memory that danced just beneath the surface. The weight of his past pressed against his chest, though his face betrayed none of it. He stared at the coffee cup before him, its steam curling upward like a fragile promise of warmth. Once his hands would have shaken as he reached for it, trembling with the ghosts of battles long ago, memories of chaos, loss, and choices no one should ever have to make. But today, something was different. Today, his hands were steady, grounded by an unspoken peace that had taken root somewhere deep within him. Across the diner, the other patrons went about their morning routines, each wrapped in their own worlds. There was Sarah, the waitress, her smile as warm as the coffee she poured, though her eyes carried the exhaustion of a double shift and a heart still mending from a recent loss. She moved with grace, balancing plates and refilling cups, her laughter a soft melody that brightened the room. She noticed Harold's stillness, the way his gaze lingered on the steam rising from his cup, and her heart tugged with a quiet respect. She didn't know his story, not entirely, but she'd seen enough of life to recognize the weight of a soul that had carried more than its share. At a nearby table, a young couple sat, their hands intertwined, their laughter bright but tinged with the nervous energy of new love. They were too caught up in each other to notice the old man by the window, but something in the air shifted as Harold's presence seemed to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. The cook, a burly man named Tom, peeked out from the kitchen, wiping sweat from his brow. His own heart bore scars, regrets from a youth spent chasing the wrong things, but he felt a strange calm watching Harold today, as though the old man's quiet strength anchored the entire room. Then there was Clara, an elderly woman who came to the diner every morning, her cane tapping softly against the floor. She sat a few tables away, her eyes sharp and knowing, watching Harold with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She'd known him longer than most, had seen the way time had carved lines into his face, each one a testament to sacrifices made in silence. Clara's heart ached as she remembered the young man Harold had once been. Vibrant, so much, Jairus with a laugh that could light up a room. Now, his laughter was rare, but his presence carried a different kind of light, one forged in the fires of hardship and tempered by resilience. The moment of transformation came quietly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't marked by grand gestures or loud declarations, but by a single, fleeting interaction that changed the way everyone in the diner saw the world. A young boy, no older than 10, had wandered in with his mother, his eyes wide with curiosity. He noticed Harold's shoes, worn, patched, barely holding together, and tilted his head, puzzled. His mother, distracted by her phone, didn't see the way her son's gaze lingered. The boy approached Harold, his small voice cutting through the diner's hum. "Why are your shoes so old?" he asked him, innocent but direct. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. Harold's eyes met this boy's, and instead of the weariness that usually clouded them, there was a spark of something warm, almost amused. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady, and began to speak. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life lived with purpose. He spoke of days when those shoes had carried him through places no one should have to go, of moments when they'd been his only companions in the dark. He didn't talk of heroism or glory, those words felt hollow to him, but of duty, of showing up when the world demanded it, even when it hurt. The boy listened, his eyes wide, his small heart swelling with something he couldn't yet name. His mother, now paying attention, felt a pang of guilt for her earlier distraction, but also a surge of gratitude for the man who'd taken the time to answer her son with such care. Sarah, pausing mid-pour, felt tears prick her eyes, not because of the story itself, but because of the way Harold's voice carried a quiet strength that made her own struggles feel a little less heavy. Tom, still watching from the kitchen, felt a lump in his throat, remembering his own moments of redemption, the times he'd been given a second chance when he least deserved it. Clara, her hands trembling slightly, smiled softly, her heart full of pride for the man who'd never stopped being a hero, even if he'd never call himself one. The diner was different now, though nothing tangible had changed. The chair by the window still creaked under Harold's weight. The coffee still steamed, its warmth a small comfort in a complicated world. But the air felt lighter, infused with a shared understanding that hadn't been there before. The patrons, each carrying their own burdens, began to see one another differently, not through the lens of judgment or indifference, but with a quiet, unspoken gratitude. They saw the worn shoes, the steady hands, the man who'd lived a life of service without ever asking for recognition. They saw the hero who didn't wear a uniform, but whose presence was a testament to the kind of courage that doesn't fade with time. Harold reached for his coffee again, his hands steady as ever. The trembling that had once haunted him was gone, replaced by a peace that felt hard-won but enduring. He didn't know it, but in that moment, he'd given the diner something precious. A reminder that heroism isn't always loud or flashy, that it can live in the quiet moments, in the worn-out shoes of a man who simply kept going. And as the sunlight continued to pour through the window, bathing the room in its golden glow, the diner felt like a sacred space where peace was not just deserved but honored in the hearts of everyone who bore witness.